They buried 7 boys in silence, but 3 nights later, the church bell rang, though no one had touched it. The dirt was still fresh. April 1860, outside of Ashcroft Parish in northeastern Kansas. 7 small coffins lined up behind St. Florian's Church, each lowered into the cracked soil under a moonless sky. No family present, no names spoken aloud, just Father Malloran, 2 grave diggers, and a ledger that would never be filed. But before the last coffin hit earth, the younger digger froze mid-motion, his face drained white. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. It sounded like tapping, muffled, frantic, from beneath one of the boxes. The priest didn't react. He only whispered a single Latin phrase, non resurgam. "I will not rise." Then the digging resumed. That same night, the winds howled unnaturally through the chapel rafters. Villagers claimed they heard the pipe organ echoing with no one inside. The following morning, when a nun went to light the altar candles, she found the sanctuary doors wide open, and muddy, barefoot prints leading out from the nave. By sundown, 3 of the boys were back. Still in their burial clothes, silent, died and impossibly, breathing, but they wouldn't speak, not for weeks. And when they finally did, they whispered the same phrase over and over again. "We saw the faces beneath the church." By the spring of 1860, Ashcroft was little more than a scar on the Kansas frontier. 12 families, a grain mill, a church, and a single schoolroom attached to the rectory. The town owed its existence to St. Florian's Parish, erected by Bavarian settlers decades prior. But what outsiders didn't know, what even many locals refused to remember, was that Ashcroft had once been called something else. A name stricken from post records in 1832. A town rebuilt after a fire no one would admit was set on purpose. The altar boys, Thomas, Illy, and Jonah, had all been orphans taken in by the parish. No known relatives. No birth records. Just 3 matching medallions found on their necks the day they were left at the rectory steps in 1856. Bronze, with a symbol etched in the center, an inverted chalice split by a serpent's tongue. Father Malloran rarely allowed the boys outside the church walls. Locals assumed it was for discipline, but some whispered that the boys were being taught in private, forbidden rites, perhaps older than the catechism. And now 3 of them had returned from their graves, without decay, without explanation, and with nothing in their eyes but quiet terror. Sheriff Weller arrived 3 days after the resurrection. He came not because of a summons, but because of a dream, a fevered vision of children screaming beneath the church floorboards, their mouths sealed shut with wax. When he entered the rectory, he found Father Malloran sitting in complete stillness, his hands folded, a leather-bound ledger opened before him. Inside were hundreds of names, all boys, all marked with a red cross beside their last recorded date. But the last 7 entries were different. They bore no names, only dates of intake, and a short Latin phrase scribbled in hurried ink beneath each. Ad sepulturem sine nomine, burial without name. Weller asked where the bodies had come from. Malloran didn't answer. Instead, he turned the page to reveal a diagram, circular, intricate, and wrong. A design burned into the parchment, seemingly without ink. At its center, the same inverted chalice symbol the boys had worn. That night, Weller posted 2 deputies outside St. Florian's and returned home to write a letter to Topeka requesting immediate inquiry. But the letter never reached Topeka, and the deputies were never seen again. Only their boots remained, facing the church doors, still warm. Sister Clotilda had served at St. Florian's for over 20 years. She'd seen prairie madness take hold of parishioners before: grief, guilt, hallucination. But this was something else. The returned boys didn't eat, didn't sleep. They sat for hours in the vestry, rocking slightly, their eyes tracking shadows that no one else could see. Sister Clotilda began hearing faint scratching noises in the walls, like nails dragged across stone. She blamed mice, until one evening she pressed her ear to the paneling behind the altar and heard it again, this time unmistakable, whispers in Latin, but spoken backwards. That night, she followed the boys as they sleepwalked barefoot through the nave. They moved like puppets pulled by strings, their heads tilted slightly upward as if listening to something above, but their steps led them downward, into the crypt beneath the church. There, Sister Clotilda found something hidden behind a loose slab, an old, crumbling staircase descending into earth that wasn't part of any parish design. The air that rose from it was warm, foul, breathing. She lit her lantern and stepped down, only to stop after 3 steps. Etched on the stone wall in dried blood was a phrase, "The dead are not gone, only locked away." Sister Clotilde never made it past the 7th step. Something in her chest tightened, a pressure like hands gripping her lungs. The lantern flickered violently and extinguished, even though the air was still. She turned and fled, but not before catching a glimpse of something further down, rows of child-sized robes, hanging, waiting, and behind them a wall covered in faces, not painted, not sculpted, imprinted, as if flesh had once pressed and screamed against the stone. The following morning, Clotilda attempted to speak with Father Malloran, but his study door was locked from the inside. No sound, no movement. She broke it open with help from the groundskeeper. The room was empty. Only his cassock remained, folded neatly on the desk, atop a Latin psalter open to Psalm 88. "Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps." Pinned beneath it was a small key, blackened, old, and warm to the touch. Its handle was shaped like the serpent's blit chalice. Clotilde placed it around her neck, and from that moment forward she claimed she could feel her prayers being heard, but not by God. Something else had begun listening. Jonah was the youngest of the 3 who returned, no older than 9, with sunken cheeks and ash-colored lips. For 11 days he hadn't uttered a sound. But on the 12th, as Sister Clotilda tried to wash the dirt from under his fingernails, he whispered, "We weren't buried, we were taken down." When she pressed him, his voice changed, low, distant, almost like it wasn't his own. "We walked for a long time beneath the wood, past the old bones, to the mouth." Clotilda asked what the mouth was. Jonah only shivered. It breathed us in. It said it wanted to teach us how to stay dead without being gone. He began to draw symbols in the dirt with his fingers, spirals intersected by crude eyes, circles inside of hands, and again, the serpent and chalice. But the most disturbing was what he drew last, a map of the town above, with red excess over 4 homes. Clotilda recognized them, the homes of the other 4 altar boys who had not returned. By sundown, those 4 homes stood empty, doors wide open, no signs of struggle. Just the lingering smell of sulfur and soft chanting somewhere beneath the ground. On the 14th night after the burials, the church bell rang. It was 2:11 a.m., no wind, no storm, the rope hadn't been touched. Yet the sound poured out over Ashcroft like a warning, a deep, trembling toll that shook the windows and pulled people from their beds. Some claimed it rang 13 times, others swore it never stopped. Eli, one of the returned boys, stood beneath the belfry, staring upward. He was humming, not a melody, but a sequence, 3 notes, dissonant and unnatural, the same 3 notes Sister Clotilda had once heard during requiem masses said for unbaptized children. When she touched Eli's shoulder, he turned his head slowly and said, in perfect Latin, "Advenit corpus sine lumine." The body has arrived without light. That same hour, across town, the schoolhouse burned to the ground. No cause was found, no one injured, but what the sheriff discovered in the ashes chilled him to the core. 7 scorched cassocks, child-sized, arranged in a perfect circle, and in the center a stone. Black as pitch, still cold to the touch. Etched into its surface, barely visible, was a warning, "Do not teach the dead to speak." By the 3rd Sunday after the burials, the townspeople of Ashcroft refused to enter St. Florian's, not out of fear, but instinct. The sanctuary had changed. The scent of beeswax and incense was gone, replaced by the acrid tang of burnt marrow. The crucifix above the altar drooped slightly to the left, as if bowed by unseen weight. But it was the pews that disturbed Sister Clotilda most. Each morning, new carvings appeared, deep, deliberate gouges in the oak benches, not made by tools, but by fingernails. At first, they looked like random scratches. But upon closer study, they formed a sequence, letters ancient and foreign, looping back on themselves in dizzying spirals, the same symbols Jonah had traced in the dirt, one phrase repeated again and again: "He is beneath, he is within, he is owed." Clotilda took wax rubbings and sent them to the diocesan seminary in St. Louis. The reply came a week later, scrawled hurriedly across the bottom of her own parchment: "Close the church, do not answer its call, burn everything." But by the time she received the letter, the choir loft had begun humming on its own, and the boys had stopped blinking. On May 3rd, a man arrived by carriage just before dusk, alone, coat dusty, collar turned high. He carried no trunk, only a black satchel, and he introduced himself simply as Dr. Delane, ecclesiastical investigator. No one in Ashcroft had sent for him, but he claimed the diocese had. He asked to see the church immediately, examined the altar, the sacristy, the crypt, said very little, but that night he did not sleep. Instead, he sat in the nave beneath the flickering sanctuary lamp, scribbling into a thick notebook and whispering prayers in a tongue no one recognized. By morning, he told Sister Clotilda that the boys were not resurrected in the Christian sense. "They are placeholders," he said flatly, "vessels opened before their time. Something was trying to come through, but failed." He insisted that the church's foundation was wrong, that beneath the altar, below even the crypt, was an older floor. Not of this parish or this century. He had seen the same pattern once before, in eastern Prussia, 1008, 134. That church had vanished in a fire that left no ashes, and just before it burned, every bell in the village rang on its own. For 49 hours, at Dr. Delane's urging, Sister Clotilda and 3 townsmen pried up the altar stones just after midnight. What lay beneath should have been compacted earth, but it wasn't. Instead, they found a layer of obsidian tile, worn smooth by centuries. At its center, a single carved emblem, a mouth with no face. The doctor knelt, touching it gently with gloved fingers. "It's older than Ashcroft, older than Kansas. This wasn't built on sacred ground. It was built to hold something in." A low vibration stirred the air. The returned boys, all 3, began to wail in unison from the rectory, shrill and wordless, as if their spines had caught fire. Then they began chanting, in perfect unison, "Domus Clausa, Custos Mortuorum, Aperi Nobis." "The house is sealed. Keeper of the dead, open to us." Suddenly, one of the townsmen collapsed, convulsing violently. Blood poured from his nose and ears. When Delane rolled him over, the man's eyes had been replaced by pits of charred flesh, as if something had looked back from beneath the stone. Delane screamed only once before dropping his notebook and fleeing the church. But what Clotilda saw next broke her mind. The tile began to breathe. Clotilda did not sleep that night. She could still hear the breathing from beneath the obsidians, low, patient, hungry. By dawn, Dr. Delane had vanished into the prairie, his notebook left behind, soaked in dew. Inside were pages upon pages of arcane translations, ritual sketches, and historical cross-references. One chapter was titled simply, "The Book of Unburials." It outlined a forbidden rite practiced by a splinter cult of 13th-century clerics who believed in reanimation without resurrection. They taught that souls could be tricked into returning, not by divine summons, but by symbols, sounds, and specific patterns carved beneath hallowed ground. The ritual required 7 boys, all orphaned, all baptized in silence, all buried alive in consecrated soil, but never meant to return whole. Their function was not to live again, but to serve as keys. Living doors, the returned altar boys were not human anymore. They were thresholds, and something was waiting behind them. Clotilda realized this with terrifying clarity as she flipped to the last page of Delane's journal. It wasn't blank. It held a single phrase written in trembling ink, "Do not bury the eighth." But by then Jonah had disappeared, and a new boy had already arrived at the rectory. He called himself Samuel. No last name, no record of birth, no wagon seen arriving. He simply stood on the church steps at dawn, barefoot, hair matted with river silt, staring at the locked doors. When Sister Clotilda opened them, he smiled faintly and said, "I've come to serve." He was the exact age as Jonah. The same height, the same hollow gaze. Around his neck hung a medallion, tarnished bronze, bearing the now familiar symbol, the serpent's split chalice. Inside the parish, the remaining boys fell silent as he entered. Not from shock, from recognition. They sat beside him without a word, forming a perfect square around the font. And then the water began to boil, not a single flame in sight, but the surface of the holy basin hissed and spat. A crack split the marble lip, and the floor beneath it pulsed red for an instant, like something beneath the tile had blinked. Clotilda demanded to know who Samuel was. He replied softly, almost apologetically, "I'm the final mark. The others opened the gate. I am the door." That night, every candle in Ashcroft burned black, and the sound of digging echoed from beneath every home. Just before sunrise, Clotilda returned to the churchyard with a lantern and a rosary clenched in her fist. She moved to the line of 7 graves behind the church, now sunken and quiet, and then stopped at a small, freshly dug hole, an 8th grave. Its soil was still loose, but no coffin lay inside, just claw marks on the inner walls. As if something had crawled out, not in, and next to it, a 9th plot had been started, a shallow pit, barely begun, but something was buried there even if no one had seen it placed, a bundle of hair. A tooth, a child's shoe, none of it matched the boys already returned. Clotilda dropped to her knees and prayed, but the words felt weightless, falling flat against the air. A crow screamed from the steeple, and somewhere beneath her, deep below even the crypt, she heard laughter, not loud, not maniacal, playful, a child's laugh, giddy, free, and impossibly far away. She ran back inside, her hands shaking. In the rectory, she found Samuel alone, gazing at the broken font. Without turning, he spoke, "The last one comes willingly. That's how the gate stays open." By mid-May, Ashcroft was unraveling. People vanished in 2s and 3s. No screams, no signs of struggle. Just cold windows and open doors. Families fled to neighboring towns, but many were turned away. Word had spread. The priests in Topeka called it diabolical hysteria. They offered no help. Then the knocking began. It came at night, soft, rhythmic, inside the walls of every home built with timber from the same grove the church had used. Children reported hearing voices behind the plaster, calling their names. One mother said her baby reached toward the hearth and whispered, "He's here." In desperation, Clotilda sealed the altar boys inside the vestry and poured salt across the doors. She marked every window with ash and scripture. Still, on the 22nd night, she awoke to the sound of giggling. From inside the chapel walls, she tore back the paneling. Behind the lath and horsehair plaster, buried like insects, were hundreds of tiny hand prints, burned into the wood from the inside. Samuel stood behind her, watching. He smiled. "They remember now," he said, "the ones who were buried before names were ever written," and on the floor beneath his bare feet, the wood began to bleed. On June 1st, the church bell rang again 7 times. But the sound was wrong, hollow, wet. When townsfolk gathered in fear, they found the front doors of St. Florian's wide open. Inside, the pews had been overturned, the altar stripped bare, and the sanctuary lamp extinguished for the first time in 40 years. But no one was there. The altar boys were gone. The vestry door had been torn from its hinges, the salt lines scuffed away by countless barefoot print, each one leading downward into the crypt. Sheriff Weller, the last man with enough resolve to follow them, descended alone. He was gone for 3 hours. When he returned, he had no eyes. They'd been carefully sewn shut with church thread, and his mouth was filled with candle wax. Pinned to his chest was a page torn from Father Mallorin's old ledger. It read, "They remember the burial, but not the prayers." That night, the sky over Ashcroft turned the color of rust. Rain fell, but left no moisture, only the bitter scent of old wine and grave soil. Clotilda collapsed in the nave, clutching her rosary, but even the crucifix had turned its face to the wall. On the third night after the bell's final toll, villagers awoke to music. The pipe organ inside sent. Florian's played on its own, slow, discordant hymns no one had heard before, not in Latin, not in any known tongue. The melody dragged like iron chains through wet earth. Sister Clotilda, weak from fasting and fever, entered the chapel. It was full. Every pew held a figure, motionless, heads bowed, all clothed in ash-colored vestments, but they weren't breathing nor rotting. Just still at the altar stood a boy, not Samuel, not Jonah. Another, pale as milk, eyes sealed with wax, mouth sewn shut with red thread. Yet he sang. No sound escaped his lips, but the organ matched his silent chant as if guided by invisible hands. On the altar lay a chalice, inverted. Blood overflowed from it, but never spilled, hanging impossibly above the surface like suspended glass. Clotilda turned to flee, but found herself locked in place. The congregation lifted their heads in perfect unison. Wax eyes, threaded mouths, and one by one they whispered. In her mind, "You buried the body," but the voice never left. She blacked out. When she awoke, the chapel was empty, but her hands were stained red. On June 6th, Jonah was found. Not in the rectory, not in the town, but beneath the church, a gravedigger named Albie Rawlins, one of the few who had remained behind, had gone to seal the crypt with stone and lime. But when he entered, the stairs went deeper than he remembered. New steps, damp and crooked, carved from black clay. He followed them down. At the bottom he found Jonah, kneeling in a pit of red soil, surrounded by candle stubs and bone fragments arranged in the shape of a chalice. He was humming, rocking gently, and digging with his hands. When Albie approached, Jonah spoke in his old voice, childlike, frightened. "I tried to come back wrong so they wouldn't want me," he whispered. "But they took my breath and gave it to the door." Albie lifted the boy and carried him up the stairs, but Jonah screamed as they rose, his body convulsing in agony. At the church threshold, he crumbled into dust. Not ashes, soil, where he had stood, only the bronze medallion remained. Albie left it on the altar. That night, the walls of the crypt split open, and something stepped through that hadn't walked in centuries. The thing that emerged from beneath sent. Florian's was not man nor beast. Witnesses, what few remained, described it as a shape wearing the memory of a priest. Black cassock, white collar, hands clasped in prayer. But the face was wrong, eyeless, jaw unhinged with parchment, thin skin stretched over shifting bone. It moved like smoke, it spoke in silence, and wherever it passed, windows cracked inward, walls wept salt water, and crucifixes turned upside down by their own nails. Sister Clotilda, hiding in the bell tower, watched it exit the crypt and approach the altar. It paused, knelt, and placed its fingers on the medallion Jonah had left behind. Then it looked up, though it had no eyes, and said, "This church remembers." Every candle in Ashcroft ignited at once, and in every home still standing, portraits turned to face the walls. The keeper had risen. It was not there to destroy, but to harvest. The returned boys were not victims. They were vessels, rituals with skin, and the church had been the cradle for something far older than God. Clotilda tried to pray again, but she found the words came from outside her own mouth, and they weren't in any human tongue. June 9th, 1860. The last entry in Sister Clotilda's journal was written in blood, not ink. It read, "There was never a parish here, only a mouth made of stone and memory, and we kept feeding it." By then, Ashcroft no longer appeared on territorial maps. The roads leading in were swallowed by prairie. The crops wilted to salt, and St. Florian's bell tower collapsed in silence. No quake, no storm, no wind, just one long breath, drawn inward. A federal survey team sent months later found the ruins, half buried under loam. No bones, no signs of fire, only a flat plain broken by blackened tiles beneath the earth. At the center, an altar stone engraved with a name, not of a priest, but of a boy, Samuel Porta Ultima, the final door. The church never issued a statement. No inquiry followed. The Diocese of Topeka sealed its records and burned its correspondence, but the ledger survived. It was found 23 years later in a locked drawer in an auctioned estate, its final page still warm to the touch. It held only one phrase, "One more child," then the church breathes again. They say every church is built on something, a foundation, a relic, a promise, but what they don't say is that some are built to hide. Under Ashcroft, beneath what once passed for holy ground, was no crypt, no ossuary, no tomb. It was a chamber, older than the bricks above it, carved in a spiral, descending into silence. Its walls were ribbed like lungs. Its ceiling a vault of fused jawbones. At the center stood a font, not of water, but of ash and teeth. The place had no altar, because it was the altar, and St. Florian's, just the mask it wore. Those who walk too close to that land still say they hear children laughing in the wind. That prayers die on the tongue, that the ground hums when no one is near. Every so often, a child goes missing along the old trade route. No prints, no struggle, just a circle drawn in salt and a faint trail of blood leading west. And if you dig deep enough under any abandoned church in America, they say you'll find the same tile, the same mouth, still breathing, still waiting, and still hungry.